this meeting to order. Good morning and welcome to the Open Caucus. Today, focusing on threats to traditional journalism in Canada. I'm Art Eggleton, Senator from Toronto. Beside me is my co-chair, Senatrice Raymond Saint-Germain de Quebec. The Open Caucus is a forum for discussion on issues of national importance. This meeting is co-sponsored by the Independent Senators Group, the Independent Senate Liberals, and the Government Representative Office in the Senate. And for the first time, Peter Harder, who is the person of the government representative, is here with us. And thank you for your support for Open Caucus. So we now have three groups representing the majority of the members of the Senate, although some of them are still coming in a little bit later. So this non-partisan discussion is open to all parliamentarians, staff, media, and the public. The landscape of the media industry in Canada is rapidly changing. There have been a steep decline in advertising revenue for traditional media, including print, television, and radio, with accompanying cuts to newsrooms across the country. Over 90% of Canadians have internet access, and many prefer to receive the news with little or no cost to themselves and on their own time. In advertising terms, this has meant a big shift to digital media. And for example, the two biggest, Google and Facebook, have 70% of the internet advertising in Canada. So while national newspaper chains have been weakened, local journalism has been diminishing in many cases. Professional journalists are being ushered out of their jobs. In the absence of these traditional gatekeepers, many Canadians report having difficulty separating fact from fiction or fake news. With the decline of trusted resources, Canadians may know less about their community, government, and country, posing a threat to democracy. Canadians need and want accurate news to make informed decisions. Today, we explore how government can navigate this changing landscape to create conditions in which vigorous ethical journalism, open public expression, and informed debate can flourish. On logistics, three things I want to mention. Coffee and tea are available in the back of the room for anybody and everybody in the room. Translation is available. My colleagues will know how that works, but for those of you facing me, it's channel 1 for English, channel 2 for French. Thirdly, we encourage audience participation. That's what microphone number 5 is all about, sitting out there. So if you'd like to make a comment or a question, we can give you up to 3 minutes to do that. Please let our Open Caucus coordinator, Sarah, where's Sarah? There's Sarah, she's waving over there. Let her know. She'll get all that stuff, excuse me, to us. So with that, my co-chair, Senatrice Saint-Germain.
Thank you, co-chair. Bonjour, bienvenue.
Good morning and good welcome. For those of you who are francophones, the Senate explained that mic number 5 is reserved for the audience and there is simultaneous interpretation available. This morning we are concerning ourselves with the future of traditional media that are at the very heart of democracy. This future is now uncertain. We must face that fact. Paradoxically, the Canadian public increasingly feels the need to get better informed. A recent poll by News Media Canada, 94% of Canadians consider that journalism plays an important role when it comes to our national democracy. And over 90% of Canadians read the news online, but only 8% pay to buy that content. So we are at grips with an industry that is being completely overhauled and changing. As with any sector that is undergoing such changes, there are winners and losers. The crucial importance as the media is the fourth prong of power in a democratic society. We need to start by making sure that Canadians aren't in the losers group. Trust in the media is still there, but the proliferation of fake news gives us an insight into the danger on the horizon. We need professional, trustworthy, independent, rigorous news. That's what we need to protect ourselves. So this emergence of a new media era, as inevitable as it may seem, must not mean that our democracy is undercut. Without further ado, I'd like to hand the floor over to our expert panelists, and I'll allow Senator Eagleton to introduce the first panelist. Thank you.
A good panel with us this morning, which each of them bring different perspectives to this issue. We're starting with Ed Greenspon, who is president and CEO of the Public Policy Forum, which is a 31-year-old think tank that researches and reports on pressing policy issues. He wrote the Public Policy Forum's landmark report on news democracy and trust in the digital age, called The Shattered Mirror. Shattered Mirror, which was released just over a year ago. And he'll talk about it today, and maybe he'll also talk about what was in the budget yesterday, or not in the budget yesterday, on this whole issue. Mr. Greenspon is former editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, where he was also founding editor of globeandmail.com and the Ottawa bureau chief. He was also senior editor for Bloomberg News and vice president of strategic investments at Torstar Corporation. Welcome, Ed Greenspon.
Merci, thank you. Bonjour, honorable senateurs et sénatrices.
Good morning, honourable senators. I'm delighted to be here today to discuss this issue that I care very much about.
2017 report. Am I in? Yes, I am on. The Shattered Mirror, News, Democracy, and Trust in the Digital Age provided compelling evidence of the decline in news media, a deep dive into Canadian public opinion, and recommendations on what to do. We hoped it would, as we said, stimulate a necessary debate and some carefully calibrated action to preserve a foundational social good. And the necessary debate it has done in spades, and the rest is out for the jury to judge, I guess. We appreciate the interest of senators because despite the measures in yesterday's budget, of which there were two, which I guess we can discuss as we go along, but some level of support for for organizations that will provide some more local journalism and a look at how philanthropy can possibly be opened up to journalism. But despite this, we in Canada and the rest of the world are still figuring all this out, and it's not an easy policy puzzle by any means. As you know, the title of our report, The Shattered Mirror, is a reference to the 1970 Senate report, The Uncertain Mirror. Since the 1970s, things have gotten much worse. Fewer journalists are covering both democratic institutions and civic culture in both traditional and new media, and I think that's an important point. New media does not have a strong economic basis either. Canadians are increasingly being deprived of the social good of news, which is essential to knowing what goes on in our communities, courts, legislatures, other public institutions. Meanwhile, filter bubbles, disinformation, and hate divide and confuse people. This pollution of the information ecosystem poses a serious threat to social cohesion and informed choice, and again requires a carefully calibrated response that of which we're, I think, in the early stages of discussion about. PPF has been conscious to make our work about the health of our democracy. If new forms of media can do a better job delivering reliable information, all the better. The point is to save journalism, not a particular platform or company. Since The Shattered Mirror, we've had many consultations and workshops that continue to explore such questions as how to reward investment in having verifiable and reliable reporting of our public spaces, how to help reporter-driven news organizations make the transition to a digital future, how to police the public square against those who spread falsehoods for commercial, ideological, or geopolitical purposes. Today, I want to just quickly look at those interrelated problems by exploring two sets of questions. One, should public policy help out journalism? And two, should it be used to protect against fake news, disinformation, and hate? And if yes, how do we do this in the most efficacious and least intrusive way possible? The decline of traditional journalism in Canada is well documented, so I won't spend time documenting it again. The question is whether there's a role for government in all of this. And that is a legitimate concern, I think. Public policy has been an equation in the mix since before Confederation. through a postal subsidy that ensured that all citizens would have access to common pools of information. That's been, I think, one of two drivers of Canadian policy from the beginning, that there be common basis of information on which to make informed choice, and that this common basis of information not being overwhelmed by foreign information. We have our own bases, as with the creation of the CBC, the adoption in the 1960s of Section 19 of the Income Tax Act. These have been policy interventions. There's nothing novel about policy interventions in the news media. A press free from government encroachment is, of course, essential to democracy. A bankrupt press, though, cannot be a vigilant or properly free press. So policy needs to be designed that in a way that it keeps government at arm's length, as with the CBC and as with tax type of policies. Nobody wants the state in the newsrooms of the nation, and there's ways to design these policies so that would not occur. PPF has put forward proposals to help journalism without giving government entry to newsrooms. But before we go there, we need to ask whether Canadians care about journalism, because this seems to be a bit of a sticking point in some of the conversation. Do they care about this issue? We conducted 6 focus groups across Canada in English and French. We conducted a poll of 1,500 Canadians, a very comprehensive poll of about 75 questions. And our research shows that they do believe in journalism. They believe it's essential to holding elected officials to account. That's something that they get implicitly. They worry that the decline of journalism will impair investigations and the safeguarding of their rights. They're wary of the government being directly involved for the very reason that they feel this watchdog function is so precious. So it's because they believe in journalism so much that they're wary of the government getting too closely involved in it. One of the most interesting findings of our research that has been recently reinforced by the Edelman Trust Barometer is that there are high levels of trust accorded to journalism, and particularly versus trust in information from social media, from friends and family. The difference is about 40 percentage points. It's a huge material difference. Newspapers, magazines, television, radio have trust levels in the 65% to 70% range, and it's a 40-point differential over social media. In focus groups, respondents told us that when something important happens, they told us that they get most of their news off Facebook. And then they would say, almost spontaneously in every focus group, unless it's very important to me. And the moderator would say, what happens when it's important to you? And they would say, when it's important to me, we go to news that we trust. We go to sources that we know. We go to organizations, and they name individual journalists as well who they might trust. So in a sense, I think that many Canadians increasingly view news organizations like they view fire departments. They want them there to respond when they need it. They don't want to engage every day. But if something important is happening to them, they want to have the confidence that the news will be there for them when they want the news. That doesn't provide an economic basis, but it does provide a basis of public support, if you will. Among some of the recommendations that we discussed, and I don't want to go through all 12 of them here, but I'll say that we supported the idea of the creation of a local arm of the Canadian press, Presse Canadienne, whereby CP would bring its high standards and communications infrastructure to support local reporting of democratic institutions across the country. So a second CP service, a CP local service that would be a non-profit service and that would be open source to anybody to be able to use that news. A similar structure for local Indigenous news as well. A greater role for philanthropic and community-based organizations to get involved in news. Many organizations in Canada are eager to get involved but feel constrained by Canadian laws and regulations. I don't want to overstate that their level of involvement would be hugely material to the problems at hand, but it would, in an incremental basis, make a significant difference. And we also recommended leveling the tax field so it will cease to be favor for digital service providers over domestic ones, as many other countries have already done. In our report, we suggested, and this was a key recommendation of the report, how do you finance news and how do you keep the governments, at bay in terms of having discretion? We suggested that there be a levy on distributors of news who don't invest in news production. So sellers of digital advertising who don't then invest in digital production would pay a levy, much as the cable companies have paid a levy over many years of 5% of their revenues into the Canada Media Fund, and that this, therefore, would create money that's not taxpayer money. It's a redistribution of the money that is in the system, if you will. We've also looked at ways that the Canadian Periodical Fund can be reformed to distribute funds based on nothing but editorial spending, something Minister Joly has signaled that she is examining. There's no clear path forward for the news industry. The public interest lies in how journalism will be financed and therefore democracy covered. And that is, I think, the big puzzle. How do you finance journalism? That's where the public interest lies. I just want to turn to disinformation and hate for a moment. As with policy towards news, the first question that arises, should we do anything? Is there a role for public policy? Canadians obviously place a high value on freedom of expression and don't like it when people interfere with their freedom of expression. But they also value a society where women and minorities feel safe on the internet, where electoral integrity and social cohesion are protected, and all of these have come under attack through the pollution of the internet. So this is a delicate issue, again, to get those balance proper, that you don't interfere with freedom of expression. But we managed to do this, I think many people would say successfully, with anti-hate laws a generation ago, where many of the similar questions came up. PPF is in the preliminary stages of examining a range of policy solutions to protect against disinformation and hate online. It's too early to know the right answers, but among the suite of things that we're examining and looking at is disclosure within 24 hours of who has purchased digital ads in an election period and to whom they are targeted. Identification, as with traditional publishers, of owners of websites. Controls on bots and other fake people. Strengthening the rights of individuals to access the data collected on them. Deeming anyone who performs the functions of selecting what information individuals will see and in what hierarchy, deeming them to be publishers. Algorithms do what editors do. They decide who will see what. Therefore, platform companies should be treated as publishers with the same legal responsibilities that I had as editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail and globemail.com for every word and image that appeared in our publications, and they should be responsible for every word and image that appears on their sites. Finally, at the sort of more interventionist level, we would be looking at the application of competition policy and whether there should be legal sanctions against the willful dissemination of demonstrable falsehoods, as Germany is doing. All of this requires careful deliberation. I've been reading the process in the 1960s that led to the anti-hate laws, which was similarly sensitive and included major contributions by an expert commission and legislative committees, including both a joint committee of the House and Senate, and then individual committees. Certainly, senators, we need to discuss and think through these new digital threats to our democracy, along with the threats to traditional journalism. The coincident decline of an authentic news system with the rise of a fake news system is not a good development for Canadian society. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You've set the stage, put the issues on the table.
Merci beaucoup et nous aurons une période d'échange.
Thank you very much. We'll have questions and answers once we've heard from all the panelists. It's now my pleasure to introduce Ms. Pascale Saint-Ange, who is the president of the National Federation of Communications, a Quebec union that represents over 6,000 persons working in digital, media, radio, journalism, and also in communications, museums, theatre and festivals. The role of the Federation is to ensure the respect of professional media rights and journalistic integrity. Without further ado, the floor is yours, Madame Saint-Ange. Thank you. Good morning, Senators, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you in particular to Senators Eggleton and Senator Saint-Germain for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today about the threats on the horizon for journalism. Over the recent years, there have been a number of solutions that have been put forward, but there seems to be a lack of a wake-up call regarding the dangers on the horizon. The media crisis is also a democratic crisis. In order to fully take advantage of the freedom of the press, which is recognised and entrenched in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, certain obstacles need to be overcome, and unfortunately there's a storm front ahead of us. We need the media. Newsrooms and the print media have been shaken by the erosion of advertising revenues, which are increasingly in the hands of the big web presences. There are many figures that have been bandied about, but in Canada there's been closures of dozens of dailies and hundreds of weeklies in about 6 years. In Quebec, about half the jobs in print media have disappeared since 2009. The recent remarks by the board of Torstar, the owner of the Toronto Star, John Hodderidge, are unequivocal when it comes to the destiny of the media empires if nothing is done. Even despite these pillars that have existed for over a century, the demise is on the horizon. The press has been economically weakened, and therefore it is increasingly unable to resist this pressure. The press needs advertising revenue and readers, and they need to make commercial choices. It's incapable of fighting before the courts, and that is why it's not able to report public interest stories. A weak press, an isolated press, cannot face up to threats. There are many ways of killing journalism. There are assassinations, kidnappings, imprisoning, there's threats, and even assault of journalists. And this is the case of countries in war and non-democratic countries, but it is very much less subtle, of course. There is a lot of financial and economic and political pressure undermining insidiously the freedom of press. In some newsrooms, obviously, they only show what gets the highest number of hits, and everything is dictated by the number of clicks. What is the real needs of it is to meet the needs of readers and watchers? What about the freedom of the press and the right of the public to news when journalists are losing their jobs or who are being downgraded because the topics they're covering just quite simply aren't interesting enough? Now, when this quest for popularity leads to journalists and media only favouring fashionable topics, who is well served? Is the media fulfilling its real duty? At the same time, they need this income to survive. Now, another short story. A media publishes a negative article on a business person. Now, that business person is a funder of the media and so cancels his advertising contract. And then you have others who have to take up the slack, and so the media isn't overly affected. But now, do the media bosses still have that wiggle room? Are the media still self-censoring to protect their advertising revenue? And that is food for thought. Now, advertising in national newspapers dropped by 85% based on the figures that were published recently. Now, is this pressure to silence and gag the press? Why is the government promoting American social media, either by fiscal policies or by advertising income, which has doubled on these platforms? Is it a better way of reaching out to the public, or is it a well thought out plan to jeopardize and undermine the freedom of press in Canada and worldwide? And why is Canada doing so little to support media? I think it is recklessness rather than a pre-planned attack, an insidious attack. All of this goes to show that our media is jeopardized. Our media is fragile, economically speaking. You might think I'm paranoid or defeatist, but I'm not the only one to think this way. This month alone, 2 major Canadian institutions have been very concerned about what's happening with web giants and the demise of traditional media. CSIS published in a report that social media has in fact propagated fake news, and this increase of disseminating fake news has meant that traditional programming has led to an abrupt demise of traditional mainstream media, which used to be the guarantor and the safeguard of the public interest. And now we have data coming from multiple sources, this torrent unfortunately, is distorted and unfortunately undermines our democracy, freedom of speech. And it's full of lies and dupery. And we saw this in the latest US elections. For CSIS, it's crucial that we become resilient on all fronts to fight fake news, not just when it comes to regulations, verifying facts, blowing the whistle, and also stating the truth. The new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Mr. Wagner, in his opening remarks, reminded everyone that freedom of the press and expression is fundamental to democracy. And the shift to social media has come at the expense of the traditional media this court once solely relied on and continues to rely heavily on to communicate with the public. But the media landscape has changed so much in the last 10 years that it is almost unrecognizable.
Journalists whose beat was the Supreme Court, and sometimes only the Supreme Court. Now, they simply don't have the time to read a 60-page judgment and understand all its nuances before their deadline, let alone write a thorough account of it. For all practical purposes, it means that the decisions that are handed down from this bench may become less accessible to the average Canadian. Out of sight, out of mind, as they say. So when Canadians begin to question on social media, sometimes with vitriol, what some of their institutions are doing, can we really blame them? Pour terminer, j'ajouterais que ce n'est pas tout de reconnaître la liberté de presse dans les chartes.
In closing, I would add that recognising the freedom of the press in the Charter is just not enough. When it is threatened, we have to take action to protect it and defend it. Canada is not sheltered from another way of life that we haven't known thus far. The freedom of the press is at the very heart of our rights, and it's thanks to our media and journalists that we've been able to celebrate the spectacular achievements over the past century. The signals are there. The propagation of fake news and conspiracies must be taken seriously. We have put together a whole host of solutions over numerous years, from financial measures right up to educational programs. The government has everything it needs to take action. The government needs to walk the talk, and yet to date, very little has been done. Thank you so much.
Next, we have Karen Pugliese, who is Executive Director of News and Current Affairs at the Aboriginal People Television Network, and oversees production of all online and broadcast news content for APTN. Ms. Pugliese is the first Indigenous person to be honoured by the Academy of Canadian Cinema and Television with the Gordon Sinclair Award for Excellence in Broadcast Journalism. In 2017, the Canadian Association of Journalists honoured her and her team with the Charles Burry Award for their contributions to press freedom, as well as showing leadership and professional development. She's a proud member of the Algonquin First Nation of Pikwakanagan.
Pikwakanagan.
Thank you. Merci. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Kwekwe, bonjour. Thank you for having me here. I'm really pleased that you did invite a representative from independent Indigenous-owned media. I just want to acknowledge my colleagues here today. I'm familiar with all their good work. I've worked with them in some capacity, and I'll try not to be repetitive. I'm going to speak briefly about APTN, then I hope to address the issue that I believe you brought me here today to discuss, which is the threats to news for and about Indigenous peoples as the landscape in the media industry changes. I'll also tell you briefly how APTN is seeking to strengthen Indigenous news reporting and our limitations. APTN is a not-for-profit organization. We are mandatory service. APTN relies primarily on cable subscriber fees for income, with advertising revenue as a second source. We are not government funded. APTN launched its news service in April 2000. We're 18 years old. We are currently producing a half hour of national news 6 days a week, as well as a weekly investigative show and 2 hours of current affairs. I am pleased to say our work has been honoured with awards from the Canadian Association of Journalists, the Hillman Foundation, the Canadian Screen Awards, and others. We accomplish all of this with 65 staff, which includes our technical team and part-timers. Most are located in Winnipeg. However, 18 of our reporters are spread across Canada. Most of these work out of our homes. And just to give you a bit of an idea of the size, we have a political show called Nation to Nation, which is our version of, say, Power and Politics. Currently, the editorial team consists of Todd. We'll be trying to add a second person to help him out. But that's the size and the scale that you're looking at. Our staff and resources are slim compared to other national newsrooms, but we do have an embarrassment of riches compared to other Indigenous media, most of whom survive with 1 or 2 reporters. The concerns rising out of fake news and the purposeful interference in the recent U.S. election is well explored in the Shattered Mirror report. There are additional issues that I can speak to which cause gaps, misinformation in reporting for and about Indigenous peoples. As senators, you're aware of work analyzing news coverage of Indigenous peoples. You'll remember the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. You'll be familiar with the Canadian Broadcasting Act, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Generally, 4 problems have been identified and remain true. First, Canadian media lack the expertise to understand the historically and jurisdictionally complex issues impacting Indigenous peoples. As senators, you may have tried to explain to reporters Bill S3, an act to amend the Indian Act in response to the Superior Court of Quebec decision Indigenal contre Canada. If so, you will have experienced the fun and challenge of trying to explain these complicated issues to journalists firsthand. Secondly, mainstream media have a tendency to move into Indigenous communities when there's a crisis. For example, an occupation, suicides. They create a flourish of coverage for a short time, then the issue's dropped. They stop covering the community until the next crisis. York University professors Danielle Drake and Fred Fletcher have dubbed this spotlight journalism. A report submitted to the Ipperwash Inquiry by Professor John Miller demonstrated the worst consequences of this approach and the absolute failure of mainstream media to accurately or justly cover the shooting death of Dudley George. Third, mainstream media write for a mainstream audience. This influences the topics that they choose and how stories are framed. For example, research by Christine Gilchrist and others demonstrate how differently media covered missing Indigenous women compared to missing Caucasian women. Finally, Indigenous media are often at a disadvantage in expressing their point of view via governments and industry who have far superior public relations resources. As mainstream media lose resources, become more dependent on wire copy and clickbait, there is less chance than ever that they'll be able to address these issues. To fix the gaps and problems I've just described in mainstream coverage, it's been frequently recommended that the solution is to foster the growth of independent Indigenous media. Doing so would, 1, provide information Indigenous people need to make informed choices. 2, hold to account those who wield power over Indigenous peoples and communities. 3, restore, preserve, and revitalize Indigenous culture and languages. 4, inform the broad Canadian public fairly and accurately about issues they do not know and perspectives they may never otherwise hear. Challenge tropes, myths, and stereotypes about Indigenous peoples. However, there has been no government support for the growth of Indigenous media. Funding that once existed for Indigenous news services has disappeared. While Canadians are concerned about losing local coverage, most Indigenous communities have never known a local free press. Providing local news is beyond the means and the mandates right now of APTN's news service. There are unique barriers which have prevented the growth of Indigenous news outlets. Some of these were outlined in the Shattered Mirror, so I'll just highlight a few of them now. There is a lack of an accountability culture among some leadership, and usually amongst those leaders who need most to be held to account. In my first 3 years as the Executive Director of News and Current Affairs at APTN, we received at least one lawyer's letter a month. These were nuisance letters. It was bullying. Mainstream media helps foster this lack of accountability sometimes because they break the conventions of journalism in return for access. This includes offering questions to Indigenous leaders in advance, or allowing chiefs to dictate when reporters can or can't enter a community and to whom they can speak while they're there. Finally, we have a lack of trained journalists. Less than half of Indigenous people ever go to college or university. APTN is doing our part to try to address the issue of training, mentoring, and fostering journalism. We've been working with other agencies like the Canadian Association of Journalists and Journalists for Human Rights to develop paid internships and fellowships for Indigenous people to receive training as journalists. APTN is also working with journalists on human rights on initiatives to train citizen journalists in their communities in the hopes of fostering local journalism. Finding a lasting business model to support newly trained local journalists continues to be a challenge. There is room for an infant industry argument for Indigenous startups, but so far there has not been government will to do so. I will note that my speaking notes were written before yesterday's budget. I do realize there's support for some local news in there, but I don't know what it means for Indigenous local news. I'll conclude by saying the Shattered Mirror report kindly called APTN a shining light in a landscape where, quote, there are too few news outlets, too few journalists, and too little revenue. I cannot stress enough how serious this is. As a service that relies primarily on cable subscriber fees in an era of cord cutting, APTN will be facing its own challenges in the very near future. Thank you, Miigwech.
Thanks to you as well, Ms. Pugliese. Notre prochain panéliste.
Our next panelist is Mr. Matthew Johnson, who is the Director of Education for Media Smarts, Canada's Centre for Digital and Media Literacy. He is the author of many of Media Smarts lessons, parent materials and interactive resources, and a lead on Media Smarts research projects, including studies of how young youth can find and evaluate online information and news. On behalf of Media Smarts, he is writing a series of public service announcement video clips in French and English that will teach citizens how to spot false news. You've just heard about that. Authenticate credible sources, understand the difference between fact and opinion, and identify emotionally charged or inflammatory posts. The floor is yours, sir. Thank you very much.
Provides us with an unprecedented opportunity to get news and get informed. But while network technologies have made it easy to find information, they've made it just as easy for anyone to publish and distribute it as well. As a result, it's harder than ever to tell the difference between responsible journalism or accurate information and advertising, misinformation, and parody. And it's easy for any of us to help spread false information without meaning to or even knowing that we are. There are signs that Canada may be better off than other countries in terms of our vulnerability to misinformation. While we rank second in the world in terms of how many people get news from social media, we also rank among the highest in terms of how we trust traditional news outlets. Research done with young Canadian adults has shown that a typical news journey begins with a social network such as Facebook, but still most often leads to a traditional media source. Finally, Canada has a robust tradition of media literacy education, as media literacy has been a part of the official curriculum of every province and territory for more than a decade. However, Media Smarts' research has found that despite being so-called digital natives, most young Canadians do not have the search, authentication, and critical thinking skills they need to find accurate information on key topics, to recognize false news, and to participate fully as citizens in a digital world. Whether or not Canadian students verify the information they find online depends heavily on context, according to our research. Almost 9 in 10 say they take some steps to verify information that they need for school, perhaps because they know they're going to be marked on it. But just 60% do anything to verify news stories they've seen online, and even fewer try to verify information they get through social media. Considering that half of students in grades 7 through 11 routinely share news stories through social networks, young people could be sharing misinformation and propaganda, which then becomes seemingly more credible to their peers because it has been shared by a friend. When students do try to verify online information, they mostly use strategies that can be expressed in simple, easy-to-teach checklists. While these can be useful, these strategies are based on the assumption that sources are playing fair and not actively trying to fool you or promote a particular message. But the internet is full of material that intentionally blurs the lines between news, propaganda, research, and advertising, and young people are ill prepared to recognize it. At the same time, there is a risk that greater awareness of bias and misinformation may push youth into being cynical rather than skeptical. As teacher and writer Eric Palmer put it, the default used to be, I believe, and is shifting to, I don't believe anything. Not believing anything is a clear road to apathy and to feeling a lack of efficacy and investment in the political system. Obviously, a bad thing for any democracy. But a greater risk is that more awareness of bias can lead people to seek out only media that confirms the biases they already hold. This has, in fact, almost always been the default. Researchers have found that most news outlets' biases are not the result of their owners' political views, but rather their readers' views. What has changed, though, is that many of us get our news through sources such as search engines or social media. These platforms make their money largely by building profiles of us and then using those profiles to deliver content tailored to what we do, what we like, and what we believe. What works well for delivering relevant advertising, though, can privilege news stories that confirm our biases, either because they match our profile or because our like-minded friends have shared them. And it also specializes in delivering the most engaging content, which may become viral because it is heavily biased, outrageous, or just too good to be true. Even if we don't fully believe such a story, it can come to seem more credible just by being repeated, especially by people we know, such as in our friends' news feeds or Twitter feeds. Canadians of all ages, but especially young Canadians, need to learn how to effectively find and to authenticate online information. And it's essential that this education begin early. Whether or not students learn research skills in grade 9 has been shown to create a gap that persists all the way through their university careers. They need to learn how to effectively use online tools such as search engines and research databases, but also to understand that these technologies are not neutral. Like other media products, they are created by people to serve a purpose, and to use them wisely, we need to understand how, why, and by whom they were made. For example, youth have little or no understanding of the algorithms that search engines use to determine how highly different sources are ranked. And as a result, they often consider a source's place in search engine results as a sign of credibility. As one of the participants in one of our focus groups once said to me, after the first page of results, Google is dead to me. They don't realize how search engines and social networks make their money from data collection and ad targeting, or how the data that is collected about them can lead to their getting a narrower variety of news and other information. Similarly, young people need to learn to apply media literacy concepts to be able to recognize how a source's political or commercial purpose is a key indicator of how reliable it is, to understand that all sources, even legitimate ones, have biases, to read through that bias and identify those sources whose bias makes them unreliable. Research has found that readers who have received media literacy education are significantly less likely to agree with inaccurate claims, whether or not those agree with the reader's own beliefs. We also need to recognize that in today's networked world, we are all broadcasters. We need to empower Canadians, especially youth, to make their voices heard, as well as promote an ethic of responsible sharing that makes it unacceptable to spread false news and information. And finally, we need to ensure that young people and all Canadians understand that they have rights, both as citizens and consumers when online, and they have the power to influence how the people who bring them news, whether that's traditional news outlets, search engines, or social networks, do business. Nearly all media platforms earn their revenue from advertising, and many of the major changes that they have made in the past in how they do business have been the result of pressure from advertisers, who have themselves almost always been responding to consumer pressure. Thank you. Merci.
Well, thank you very much. We've had four good presentations to get us underway. And now it's time to turn it over to our colleagues and to the audience. Again, I'd remind those who are in the audience that if you want to ask a question or make a comment for up to 3 minutes, please see Sarah. She'll get your name and any affiliation that you may have down, and then we'll work it in with our questions and comments from our senators. We got 5 senators on the list so far. I just want to point out that unfortunately I have to go to another event at 10:30, so I'll be leaving shortly before 10:30, but leaving you in the capable hands up till 11:15 when the meeting ends with Senator St. Germain. So let's start with Senator Marwah.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the panelists for your great comments. And I must admit, I have great empathy with the challenges facing our industry, and it is one of the major public policy issues that we face in a democracy. But I haven't heard any of you talk about possible solutions or possible policy interventions, as you called it. One of them clearly is having the readers pay and creating a paywall, and many newspapers are trying to create a paywall, some with albeit more success than others. But what about other solutions? What about solutions such as making the carriers, the web carriers, the distributors pay for content? Are there any other solutions that, open to any of you, that you would suggest that should be pursued?
We'll start with Greenspon. If anybody else wants to get in, has anything to add differently from the panelists, we're happy to accommodate you. So.
Thank you, Senator. I spent a lot of time thinking where will the funds come to finance journalism. So it came through in 2 ways historically, both the public system, mostly through the CBC Radio Canada, and through a private system that was profitable, mostly by selling advertising, usually 80% of revenue in advertising, maybe 20% in circulation. So I don't think advertising, it's not that there's a shortage of advertising, it's that advertising has moved in a particular direction, which is, I think the rights of advertisers to go with the most efficient system that they like, and that system does not reinvest in journalism. So one of the possible sources of money is some kind of redistribution of revenues from distributors to producers, as I mentioned in my remarks. Another source is public funds, as we've seen with the CBC. That causes certain complexities, given the particular nature of news and its relationship to democracy and to power. Not impossible, because firewalls are built in other ways. So that's a form. A philanthropist is another form, and the readers are, as you say, surveys by the Reuters Institute for Journalism show that about 9% of users of news on the internet are willing to pay for it, are willing to pay for subscriptions. I think you can get certain circumstances that give a rise to that, like the so-called Trump bump in the United States that has been beneficial to a number of news organizations there in terms of subscribers. But, you've got a 10% type of figure in English language speaking countries, slightly higher in non-English language countries. I don't think that's going to support a lot of news organizations. Our research suggests that people are accustomed, in a sense, to being free riders. They sometimes feel a bit guilty about it, but they're used to it. So I think it's a medley of things that are required. Not very many paywalls are going to produce sufficient revenues in a country the size of Canada and in the sub-regions, of Saskatchewan or Regina. There's just not enough money, I think, there from readers alone.
J'aimerais en fait vous dire aujourd'hui qu'une...
Well, there is a miraculous solution that has been found to address the problem of funding content production, but it hasn't been put in place. And even with new media outlets that we've come about on the web, that exist for the web and thanks to the web, they too are facing financial pressure and are making cutbacks to their staff, etc., etc. Unfortunately, there will not be a miraculous solution. We will need a slew of solutions. Now, the FNC had suggested emergency solutions because in the short term we have already lost a lot of ground and we have to stem the tide and stop this happening. A first step was taken by the government with this $50 million investment. I acknowledge that there is there's an acknowledgement of the crisis. That's about $1 million annually from the provinces to support local media too, but it's all too little to stop this, to stem this tide. Now, there's tax credits on payroll taxes, and that, in a way, is a way of making the state at arm's length from media outlets, and you get revenue from tax credits. That's a short-term solution that may stem the tide. But over the long term, we're going to have to think at length about solutions. We've always said in Canada that the market was too small for, well, both in terms of entertainment content and other content, that it can exist by itself without government help. In 1990, the Canadian Media Fund was therefore set up, and money was taken not only from government coffers but also from subscribers' fees to invest in content production. And so this specific production fund was created. A levy was then made on GAFA. It's not even public funds I'm talking about here. And GAFA ends up paying for it. It might be internet service providers. There's a whole slew of solutions available to us, but we need to pull up our sleeves and get to work.
Well,
Senator Black.
thank you very much. And just like my colleague, Senator Marwah, I want to thank you all for being here. This is an extremely important topic. My question follows on Senator Marwah's question, but I do want to offer an observation, first of all. We all recognize in this room that the media are a key element of democracy. That's why we're here. That's why we're struggling with trying to figure out what do we need to do here. But it will not be helpful to the media's cause if you portray yourself as victims. It never is. So I would just urge you to always remember that you're caught in a difficult circumstance. We agree, and we want to be helpful. But in some way you have contributed to it as well. I'm not saying in what percentage, but it will not be helpful at any level if you come before people and say, similar to taxi cab operators, Uber has to go away, you need to protect my business. Uber's not going away. And people aren't interested in protecting businesses per se. Why we're interested in your business is because you are an element of protecting democracy. So, just from my point of view, a little bit of an honest assessment, because ask Tanya Harding, victims don't work. So, but I'm on your side. Having said all of that, I'm on your side. I'm interested in knowing view is on creating a fund which would be raised by taxing Netflix, Facebook, Google, etc., who are enjoying tremendous opportunities in Canada but aren't paying any of the freight. So, point one. Point two, what is Europe doing on this issue? I understand in particular Germany is quite advanced in recognizing this is a problem and dealing with it. So I always figure if you don't have to reinvent the wheel, don't. So I'd be interested in your reaction on both of those points as succinctly as you possibly can, please.
Who wants to go first?
I can go.
Madame Saint-Onge, ensuite Monsieur Greenspon.
Vous avez tout à fait raison.
Absolutely. It's never a good idea to try and come across as the victim. But far from being a victim, we have to expose the facts as they are. And the way that you describe the state of affairs is the way it is. And we have to face this on a daily basis. However, the industry has to adapt and react. But these changes are happening so quickly. We don't have the luxury of time anymore. We need to sound the alarm bells before it's too late. As far as funding through GAFA taxation is concerned, that seems to be the most promising way ahead. They make the money through the content that's produced. There are other approaches, also copyright. How is it that publishing houses don't demand their copyright dues when these platforms are being propagated and creating content? Obviously, at some point, we are going to have to force these businesses to become part of our economic landscape in Canada and pay their fair share. Now, when it comes to Europe, the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of European countries fund their print media in a far more transparent way than we do. Prior to this $50 million investment in Canada, there was a combination of federal and provincial funding to the tune of about $4.93 million annually for also the periodical fund and magazines and support for the print media. Now in the US, it's $5.83 per person. So even Trump's beating us on that mark. Now, there's $27 a year for one country and $92 for Finland. And we look at Reporters Without Borders and freedom of press throughout countries and their rankings. Those are the countries that are the most highly ranked are Scandinavian companies, because they are the ones who, through public funding, support the print media and media outlets. So we read to emulate Europe because fabulous things are happening there. Thank you very much, Ms. Saint-Onge.
Thank you, Senator Black. Certainly, I don't know if I should rise to the victim question or not rise to the victim question, but, certainly the media have made their own mistakes. I'm not, as I said earlier, our work is all about not saving particular companies, saving particular platforms, newspapers as a platform, if you will, but is in making sure that democracy is well served by journalism. Even those media who seem to have made a lot fewer mistakes, and I would take as an example perhaps La Presse in Montreal, which moved successfully and aggressively from a readership point of view, certainly onto a tablet platform when tablets made sense and made a good transition, but then smartphones came along and tablets don't make as much sense, and now you have to spend tens of millions of dollars again to sort of try to reinvent your product. So it's a very expensive business and a constant disruption to finance with reducing revenues. There's also an economic reality, which is that the unit value of a piece of advertising digitally declines and has declined every year because there's no scarcity principle as there is for print, where there's only a certain number of pages, or television, radio, where there's only a certain amount of time. So there's infinite numbers of impressions, and what we've seen is the values have fallen from, in some instances, $15 a thousand for newspapers to $2.50 or $3. So even as they're increasing their sales, their revenues. The revenues have held steady at $220 million about for 10 years in the digital side. There's no growth in the digital side, which is not very good. And at the same time, yet, reach is greater than ever. So news companies are actually reaching more people than they've ever reached through the combined platforms that they have. As for international examples, I guess I'd say two things. One on the nobody's got it cracked. The BBC has put some money from its charter and committed money over the period of its charter, which is approximately 10 years, I think, in the current manifestation, to putting 150 local news reporters out through the country in newspaper newsrooms to work for them with some support from the BBC and some help also on data-driven journalism where they would work together. So that's similar, I think, in some ways. Nobody understands exactly what the government said yesterday, but there were $50 million over 5 years to go to independent, non-governmental organizations to support local news across the country. I think they're looking at something like the BBC model, but not with the same with the CBC as being the sponsor of that model. On the new issue about regulation of the internet and what goes on the internet, you mentioned Germany, and Germany's been probably the most aggressive of the countries, in part because, particularly against hate and particularly against perpetuation of of Holocaust denial and items like that. The jury's completely still out on that. They've created a system where, things that are identified to be hateful need to be removed within 24 hours, and it's subject to a very large fine if they're not removed. There's an intrusiveness. Brazil is looking at something similar, but, political parties will be involved in some way or another, and friendly academics will be involved. So, who is the judge of truth and not truth, obviously, is as big a problem as is the fact that our classic defense, which is a truth and falsehood, will grapple in an open forum, and people will be able to decide. Doesn't very well if you have filter bubbles and people aren't exposed to the same truths and falsehoods, but particular ones. So those are things that are out there. I think the one thing that recommends itself to me about the German models, it does make the decision to treat to say that platforms are responsible for what occurs inside their environment. Now, how that should be policed and what the responsibility should be, but we traditionally have two things that we do. Either you're a publisher and you're legally responsible for what appears in your site, or you're a common carrier and you're in some form or another regulated. And I think, we don't want to fall between those two stools. We kind of want to decide on a stool.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
To the first question, because that's outside of our mandate as an educational organization. But I will say, on the question of what Europe is doing, there's been some recent research that in Finland, they have been subject to a really intense misinformation campaign, apparently by foreign powers. And what the research has shown is the reason that it did not have an appreciable impact there is largely because of the robust tradition of media literacy education in Finland's education system. And I think a lot of the talk so far has been about interventions to guarantee the supply of traditional news, which certainly has its place. But I think we need to consider demand as well, because there is a lot of evidence that media literacy education creates a demand for legitimate news by promoting what's sometimes called critical loyalty, and that is loyalty to accuracy, loyalty to an idea of the truth over one's individual political loyalty. And so people who have that critical loyalty are motivated to go beyond that first source, to go beyond the social network material that's delivered that they agree with, to actually seek out the truth. And that creates a demand for legitimate news and legitimate information. And that seems to be what we've seen operating in Finland.
Okay. Our speakers list is Senator Mercer, Cordy, Galvez, Bove, and Harder. At this point in time, we can add anybody. Senator Mercer, you're next.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, panelists, for being here. I've got 4 very quick questions, and I'm trying to eliminate any preamble so I can you can get to. Is there a model anywhere in the country of a print industry that actually is working? I think of my home province of Nova Scotia, where we have only one major newspaper across the province, and they now own all the other newspapers across the province. But behind the scenes, they are a major producer of advertising, like flyers, etc., that drives revenue into the company. It's not necessarily the stuff that you see in the paper, but the stuff that somebody delivers to your front door somehow. And is there a model that works for that? The second thing is with respect to the Aboriginal Peoples Network. I've always thought that the network was really also, besides being a news outlet and an entertainment outlet, was a community development outlet that helped develop communities that existed, and now with their own media, it's raised the level of sophistication of interaction between people in the Aboriginal community. My third question is with respect to how do we educate the public, particularly young people, on how to test the accuracy of social network news outlets. I mean, that is a problem, and should it be taught? Should it be a subject that's taught in public schools, so that young people who are all sitting there with their smartphones should be saying, here's how you figure out whether what you're getting is accurate. And my last question is one that's not. Nobody at the panel may be able to address this because you're not from this group, but should we be re-examining the Broadcasting Act and redefining the role of the CBC?
I'll call that one question in 4 parts.
Okay.
With probably different people answering them. Who wants to start? Well, we'll start since the your network was mentioned, Ms. Pugliese.
Thank you. I'll answer, I guess, 2 of your questions. One of them, you asked if there are successful models out there of newspapers. So in the world of Indigenous media, I would say that one of the most not expensive, but one of the most successful has been Windspeaker. I think they are still doing a print version, but they've moved online. There's also Eastern Door. When I was last speaking to the publisher over there, he thought that keeping a print option was working for them, although they're also available online. I think for some other startups, and you can think of places like Media Indigena, who've launched a new site, and there's a few others, they're trying that model where people, it's either subscription or partial subscription, where people can donate money through an agency like Patreon if they feel like supporting it, but they put their media out there. They're all small. I think the challenge is when we're working in some local communities, like when we were working in Hollow Water recently with Journalists for Human Rights, we sent in a reporter. They did a month of really good training. 16 individuals were able to be paid to take that training, and we're really anxious to do some journalism, some pretty hard-hitting journalism too. But once we leave, there's no business model. So earlier when I was mentioning sort of like an infant industry, I think there needs to be, because of some of the unique challenges regarding education, there's less barriers to entry in terms of costs of startup if you're going to be online, but there certainly are legal issues, et cetera. Some sort of protection while they kind of figure it out, because there are models out there that could emulate, but it's just they're starting with no capital. They're starting with nothing. So if there was some way to just kind of protect them for a few years while they could foster it and figure it out, I think you could develop a richer local media for Indigenous people. Having said that, I think that APTN does foster a community. I wasn't quite sure what the question was, but we have developed, if I get your meeting, a community of producers, and we have developed a brand that's very trusted amongst our people. The reference earlier to the firemen or the fire station, it's one of those things that people do come to us when they see an issue and they say, well, what is it really about? What is the context going to be? What does it mean? You know, have the other media gotten it right? We do recognize that we carry that brand, and we're very proud that we've developed that.
Merci. Mr. Greenspon?
I'll take a quick poke at a couple of your questions. There are some successful models going online. In your native province of Nova Scotia is allnovascotia.com, but it's a niche and closed product. It's not a product that's easily becomes part of a media ecosystem. In fact, as I think you probably know, if the CBC, for instance, reports with credit a story from allnovascotia.com, they will lose their subscription to allnovascotia.com. So it's meant to be, closed in. Nonetheless, successful and doing a good job on the news as far as I can see. Ideologically based kinds of sites tend to do a little bit better because they have a passionate following of people who are looking to affirm beliefs. I'm not sure that's great for, I think, our concern around the commonweal, but that's happening. There's a couple of people who are innovating in ways that are hard to completely understand, but seem to be having some traction. There's a idiosyncratic kind of situation in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, where all of the radio stations are owned by, I think they own 3 or 4 radio licenses there, and they've used that as a platform to build a bigger portal with a lot of reporters, actually. Same thing is happening in Northern Ontario. In smaller, closed communities without a lot of competition for ad dollars, there seems to be some kind of opportunity there to maintain the presence. So, there are some models. As Karen said, when you add them all up in terms of reporting capacity, there's not a lot. There wouldn't be enough to probably fill, the newsroom of the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star or La Presse. So, that's a problem with these new entities. They, don't have enough revenue or capital to support much reporting. The point that you ask, the only other part of it I'll tackle a little bit is the question of that Matthew also raised already, and that you spoke to, Senator, about public awareness and understanding, and clearly a public individuals who can discriminate between truth and falsehood is a gift. I would just sort of say that critical thinking is a gift that goes beyond the situation that we're talking about in news. I'd also say that, to use the demand-supply analogy, that I sometimes think of what's happened on the internet as like, one of the Great Lakes in some ways. So the internet is Lake Erie. And when some of us were young, Lake Erie was very badly polluted, and people said the lake was going to die. It didn't die. It was revived, and there were signs that said bathers don't go in the lake, and that's media literacy. But there was also efforts to stop putting pollutants in the lake, which is an important part of the supply equation. I think you've got to be pushing on both sides.
Merci. Sur des aspects complémentaires, Madame Saint-Onge.
Oui. Thank you, Madame Saint-Onge. As far as online models is concerned, the big problem that media outlets online face is that newsrooms are very expensive to run. And often it's journalists who are out in the field, investigative journalists, that have to be paid for somehow. And it's very costly. And it really doesn't draw in much advertising revenue because, advertising revenue online is is a different kettle of fish from what is charged for print media, because Google and Facebook are driving down advertising costs online. So what do newspapers do? Digital newspapers, unfortunately, drive down their rates, and that's why it is so tough supporting our traditional newsrooms. That's what the problem with the current model is. As far as CBC Radio-Canada is concerned, we represent Radio-Canada employees in Quebec City and Edmonton, and we have been fighting for CBC Radio-Canada programming for a long time, because as revenues have been driven down, CBC Radio-Canada has been drifting into the private market in order to compete. So given this backdrop, and there's an increasing number of cable subscribers, there is ferocious competition with private companies. So CBC Radio-Canada really has to really make sure its foothold is strong enough, and we have to think about the way that we fund Radio-Canada going forward, despite the investments that we saw yesterday, which are of course welcome, but perhaps inadequate to fulfill its public mission. So we have high hopes, and I'd like to take this opportunity to turn to the question of education. We do have to deal with media literacy education. Do we need curricula in schools? But first and foremost, we have to educate teachers, because they don't necessarily have that media literacy to teach their students how to differentiate between fake news and real news. So we need to educate the broader public. And this debate that we're having, and particularly in the last several months, will increase awareness among the general population and help us to broaden our approach.
Would not disagree. So, Mr.
Absolutely.
Johnson.
Obviously, I'm really only going to address the last part of that question. But before I do, to go with your metaphor, I would say that media literacy certainly does include putting up the sign saying don't swim in the lake, but it also includes teaching people that they have a right to insist that the lake be cleaned up. That media literacy is not just about making better consumers, it is about making more active citizens and teaching people that they have rights and how to take advantage of them, and that they have voices and how to be heard. But to answer your question, yes, I do. All of these skills do need to be taught in school, preferably starting early, because we know that young people start going online early, and one of the reasons why they start going online is to find information, typically for school, and also for their personal interests. And it's very easy to come across all kinds of misinformation, and because of the networked nature of the internet, it's also very easy to wind up in a swamp of conspiracy theories or just even hoax sites that are produced for entertainment, but which people might not immediately recognize. And it's not just my opinion that this should be taught, because, as I said, it is in the curriculum of every province and territory. But there are a few reasons why it's not always implemented in schools. One of those is that curriculum is a very slow ship. And so the curriculum that addresses these things could easily have been written 10 or 20 years ago, and may have tremendously valuable things about, for instance, comparing two newspapers or two newscasts to identify what's covered in one and what's covered in not covered in another, but doesn't take into consideration, because it couldn't, our environment today where anyone can produce and distribute news, or what they claim is news. And as a consequence of this, teachers often do not feel qualified, and indeed are not qualified. That they don't know what skills young people need. They don't know how to teach them. A big part of my job is doing research to identify these skills and the best way to teach these skills, doing research to identify what information seeking and evaluating practices young Canadians are already engaging in, and producing resources, because we need to put lessons in the hands of teachers so that they feel confident teaching these things, and we need to provide them with professional development so that they feel that they can do it. This is something that we're doing currently with digital literacy, with support from the federal government's CanCode project, but it's something where we need support teaching these media literacy, and an area such as authentication that is very much an overlap between media and digital literacy as well.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup. I want to stress on the fact that the two senators here are members of the Transport and Communication Senatorial Committee, So it will be interesting to listen to their questions and perhaps the follow-up we can make. But just before them, Senator Cordy.
So clearly I'm not on the Communications Committee. Thank you very much. This has been very helpful and most interesting, and I think very timely. Canadians are starting to talk about the need to do something. And Mr. Greenspon, you spoke about the Canadians valuing a society where women and minorities feel safe, especially on social media. And yet you look on social media and what's happening is a travesty. The racism, the sexism, the vitriol, the hatred is rampant. There is a public outcry to producers like Facebook and Twitter to do something about it. You also spoke about the bots and the need to control the bots, and we know they were, certainly from what we've read, is that they were prevalent during the last United States election. We know that what I'm reading certainly is that there's a fear that the bots may be used in 2019, and a lot of bots apparently have been removed, but from what I've read about them, there might be 2,000 here and you remove those, but there are 2,000 just ready to move in instantaneously, and it just continues. So how do we solve that? And I guess my question about the bots and the vitriol and hatred on social media, is the anonymous nature of social media harmful to Canadians? Because you're hidden behind no name, you're hidden behind a phony name, and you feel, I look at what some people write and I'm astounded that they would make that public.
Well, thank you for those questions. I'm going to start with your last one because I struggle a lot with this question. I also often think that a lot of the hatred is coming from behind a digital version of a Ku Klux Klan hood, and that disturbs me. By the same token, in other countries, people use anonymity to try to fight for freedoms against repressive regimes. So it's a delicate question of anonymity. The bot question is a much more straightforward one. There should be people with real identities behind that. CBC, I'm sometimes discouraged because CBC and some other media outlets have themselves said you can't be anonymous to comment on our sites, and that hasn't stopped the vitriol and the misogyny, the racism from that. I don't know if there's something inherent in that form of instant media and instant response, but from the moment we had comments at the Globe and Mail, we would receive approximately 350 letters together a day. You as readers might see 15 of them, but the 350th was usually more erudite than and civil than the 10th comment. So it was striking in that way. Maybe I'll leave it at that. With that point, I'm tempted to rise back to the fake news issue, and maybe I'll just say one thing. It's not easy to discern the falsehoods when they're cleverly projected. So the Russians had a Facebook site that, among other things, was just doing anti-shale oil type of stories that might be similar to others. But the Russians have a good economic interest in keeping down the shale industry in the States. So I don't know how that would have necessarily been obvious unless people have to also identify who owns a site, and that kind of work goes in there. I think everybody knows that two groups were brought out in Houston, an anti-Islam group and a pro-Islam group at the same time at the same place, so they could possibly foment by Russian sites, so they could possibly foment some actual violence there. So it's not just being smart. At source, we also have to make sure that somebody is responsible, and I'm suggesting that the platforms who put this up have to bear some responsibility, and when they bear responsibility, they will be more incentivized to take actions.
Thank you, Madame Saint-Onge.
Très rapidement, même si j'ai dépeint un portrait.
Well, unfortunately, I've been quite somber today. Normally, I'm an optimistic type. But let's look at what's happening with new technologies and any other technological innovations. Cars. When cars were developed, there was no road rules, and now we have road rules. And most people have cars, and most people drive without with a modicum of accidents, but with the internet and new technologies, all of this is just happening so quickly. Everyone has their device, and regulations are lagging. We need to get ahead in terms of regulating. And as time goes by, organizations will regulate online behavior because freedom of expression has always been within certain bounds and limits, especially when it comes to hate speech. So there will be steps that will be taken, and in Europe we can see that a lot of headway has been made. They're ahead of us on that game, and I think that there'll be new legislation in the pipeline.
This question, Mr. Johnson?
Well, what the research shows is that there is an important difference between genuine anonymity and pseudonymity. So spaces that are genuinely anonymous, where no one has a persistent identity, are more prone to harassment of all kinds. Spaces that are pseudonymous, where you have an identity that is not your own but that is persistent, don't seem to be any more prone to harassment than spaces where you're required to use your real name. So that doesn't seem to be precisely what's at work. What does seem to be the issue are what we call empathy traps of digital communication. And that is essentially that you are not talking to someone in person. You don't have to see the look on their face when you say something to them. You don't have to hear them. You don't even necessarily have to stay and wait for them to reply. You can leave a message and leave. This is a big part of what we teach in our digital literacy program for young people, is to have more conscious habits of empathy, and also what we call digital mindfulness. That is to say that you may yourself not be conscious of how you're feeling, of your own emotions when you're communicating online, because you're communicating almost exclusively, through your fingers or even through just your thumbs, and you don't feel physically present. And that as well seems to have an effect of reducing responsibility for what you say and do. And the only solutions that we found, again, are to encourage from as early as possible conscious habits of mind, of being more empathetic, of considering what we're going to do, and also empowering people to improve the baseline behavior of their online communities. Because, again, what the research has shown is that the noisiest 10% in any community set the tone. They set the values and norms. And so if the noisiest 10% are making harassment normalized, then other people, they won't necessarily engage in it, but they'll tolerate it. If the noisiest 10% make it clear that harassment will not be tolerated, that's actually been found to be more powerful and influence than any kind of top-down moderation.
Thank you. Maintenant, une sénatrice membre du Comité des Transports et des Communications.
Senator, member of the Transport and Communications Committee, Senator Galvez.
As in this very important and critical subject. I don't have a question, but I have some observation and some ideas. I happen to have been in your medium, in your sector for more than 20 years. So I learned to appreciate the good aspects in journalism and media, but also to see the bad aspects. So it's just sad to learn that this crisis didn't start yesterday or even 1 year ago. It had started maybe 20 years ago. And that today we are in the, in the explosion and we are in panic mode. But maybe we can go back and see what were the good things that were happening and what were the bad things. And so we can just be positive and go into the positives. So, I used to read lots of media, and I stopped like that drastically, because to a point I had too much with bad news or good news. I was really couldn't take it anymore. Sensationalism, too much of this. Imbalance between advertising and the news. You know, there was a lot of advertisement and then there was a little news. So there was an imbalance. Then I am very touched by environment. So seeing the waste of paper in the written media, it was, for me, was very bad. And also the fact that there were these politicized media and mega magnets of media controlling the news was really bad. But the good aspects were that I was always willing to read about investigation and enquete, inquiries, analysis, perspective, reflection. There were some start reporters that you connect with them. And they disappear and they were not replaced, but that was very good. Then the role of whistleblower of the media, that's so important. Because you are protected, your sources are protected. So this role of whistleblower is important in society. Then the fact that you were covering local news. What can I do with things happening in India? Very bad news happened in India, but I am here and I want to help here. So local news was very important. The fact that there was something on science, on democracy, on health, that was also positive. And of course, the freedom of expression. So media didn't adapt to the changes fast enough, and we are in this crisis now. But you can recuperate, and you can imitate what the new outlets are doing. And on policy, France is just going to give a legislation on fake news. So I think you have to come and be the initiators of policy and come and tell us how can we do something to help you. There are attempts to tax multimedia networks. We know that it's not fair for media here. But also the other point is about copyright, because it's true that people go into Facebook and take the content there, but lots of it comes from the normal media, you know, and so why they don't? What happened with the copyright? What happened with the rights of the original author of the news? So yeah, so these are my comments.
Well, it's close to be an editorial. It's very interesting. So who wants to comment on the comments? Madame Saint-Onge.
Je voudrais juste...
I'd just like to come back to the issue of copyright. Indeed, people fail to understand why publishing houses don't demand copyright payments. But in order to do so, each and every newspaper would have to sue these platforms like Facebook and Google, and that could be lengthy and costly. So we're looking at other avenues. Could publishing houses band together and sue in a common law suit? And perhaps there's something in the Copyright Act that is worth looking at. So we just need to determine whether or not we can make headway with this kind of approach. But independent journalists should be demanding this when it comes to copyright. They should be demanding a certain amount of money for various platforms, and then these funds could be divvied up to take more fulsome steps. So there is a review of the commission of the Copyright Commission to look at these delays, because in the digital world it's unacceptable. But these are just assumptions and hypotheses over many years. But for the most part, I agree with you when it comes to the quality of the news. Unavoidably, our media outlets have been forced to make a financial choice, but we need to get back to quality media. And I represent most journalists in Quebec, and there's not a single one that isn't proud of their job and want to do their jobs under the best conditions possible.
I would, first off, just take an old quote from Albert Camus, who said that that a free press is not necessarily a good press, but a press that is not free is necessarily going to be a bad press. So sometimes the press is good, sometimes the press is bad, but if you don't have a functioning press to the point of your, let's say, as one example, your whistleblowers, we're seeing a lot of whistleblowing in the United States, and people who know how to handle information they get from whistleblowers and organizations that have legal advice built into them and standards and a culture of doing this. And I think it's necessary, obviously very necessary to maintain that. I agree with what Pascal says about the copy. You know, we do have a review of the Copyright Act. And in the United States, certainly the publishers have asked to have an exemption under competition rules to be able to negotiate together, to have some equivalence of power in negotiations. That's an interesting concept. It's also, though, true that if you didn't want your material, if you didn't want Google, for instance, going through your news site, you can actually turn that off. That's a little switch that's there on your site, and you can turn that off or on, but it's hard to sort of say, well, we're not going to have our news be searchable. The same is usually true with Facebook. Facebook has audience, and it's a very difficult deal for publishers, but they could say, no, you know, we're not going to post our stuff. Other people might, but we are not going to post on Facebook. Those who have looked to Facebook and Google as their salvation have found it's a pretty bumpy road, because every 3 or 4 months it seems that they change their algorithm, and recently have downgraded news from, as they did in June 2016 before the U.S. election, which added to the problems of fake news versus false news. They downgraded news from known publishing organizations in favor of news from friends and individuals, and they've just done that again recently in a number of countries. So it's a tough road, but you know, they do have choices, and they tend to make the choice of allowing their material to be available.
Juste après l'intervention de la prochaine sénatrice, je vais laisser.
Just before the next speaker speaks, Senator Beauvais
Of the Senate Committee on Transport and Communications.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I'd like to thank you all for your insights. You've raised lots of issues that will make some very interesting and worthy discussions and studies, I think, for the Transportation and Communications Committee. So we'll put those in the mix. I want to go back to solutions, and from another perspective, we've talked about ads and news and training young people and the public on fake news. I want to congratulate APTN. As a Winnipegger, I have to say I've followed your rise with a great deal of pride, and thank you. And I've certainly witnessed the growth of the substance of your coverage and your reporters, and so my hearty congratulations. And I'm delighted you're here to voice the Indigenous peoples of Canada, and we in the Senate are here to give voice to minorities and to our region. So I feel we're certainly partners. You mentioned the need for training. And I guess, alas, I'm old enough to remember the rise of the journalism programs in the 1960s and 70s. I know before then, the journalists I know who came into the field before then did so through some very strong and important apprenticeships. So my question for you is, what kind of training do you feel would be journalists and the support producers and technicians, what do you feel needs to be put in place to provide the training for journalists from the Indigenous communities?
It's a really interesting question, because it starts back in the communities, right? Mm-hmm. And the idea that You sometimes only have a K to 6. It's a struggle for some young people to leave their families behind at the age of 12 or 14, go into a strange town. A lot of them are not successful during that separation period at even finishing their high school. If they can make it through high school and go to university, not all of them do choose journalism as a field. So when we're out there hiring, we're frequently picking up people who we feel have potential. I have brought in people straight out of high school, and we've created training programs for them, particularly for broadcast, because that's what we do. So we bring in VJ trainers. We've brought in some of the best people that we can think of in Canada or the US. We have a training session coming up where we're bringing in Al Tompkin of the Poynter Institute to work with some of our new journalists. So we've really sort of taken on this function of turning people into journalists because we have this need to satisfy, like we have to keep our bureau staffed. I think beyond that, for some of the work that we're trying to do with JHR is going into communities and just encouraging people that this could be a field that they could go into. I think as we start to look at solving some of the basic problems with the K to 6 and the high school education, that's going to level people up and get more people into university. I think also just encouraging them that there's jobs out for them and helping them transition. There's a lot to take in when you're taking somebody who has no journalism background and bringing them in and teaching them from scratch about the newsroom, about the purpose of news. We have a rather thick journalistic policy that we go through that's kind of a 101 on how you behave on social media as a journalist, right up to the legal ramifications of what you might be writing. So there's a lot of training there, but it's getting, I think, encouraging some Aboriginal people to just go into the field and then giving them that support throughout their lifelong learning.
Just make
Yes,
one
question.
quick comment, and maybe it's just an observation. You talked about your journalists having to go into crisis situations, and then they leave the community, and those crisis situations have to be very tough for a young, I'm going to call them apprentice journalists, to go into. And so, is there a great loss of potential Indigenous journalists early in their career?
We have, it is tough. It is really tough to go in and cover these issues. And we have had, like in our own newsroom under our own health insurance policy, we've worked with the suppliers to make sure that elders are included in counseling, as well as sort of mainstream counseling. I know there are some people who have left the field or left APTN because they couldn't continue going into the communities and covering some of the issues that are really difficult to cover. We do our best in-house to support them, and we have frequent talks about, we've put a lot of the healing and mental health issues right out in the open. I think it's one of the very bad mistakes that the news environment has been trying to learn to cope with, not just APTN, but overall in years, because I have worked with people who've had post-traumatic stress disorder. I've worked with people who, and not just in APTN, who have, under the pressures of their jobs, tried to take their own life. And so we're very sensitive to what we're sending people out with, but we're also sensitive to when we're interviewing people in the communities who might be residential school survivors, just taking that extra step and telling them that perhaps they should have somebody there. Do they have a plan? Do they have a care plan for themselves after the interview? So we try to have the care plan for our journalists, and we encourage people to have their own care plan as well.
Maintenant, je vais laisser la parole à...
Now I'll hand the floor over to an expert when it comes to this, Professor Bertras from the University of Ottawa, who is the publisher of the Cahier du Journalisme. Good morning. Just a quick bit of input from me. When asked what the worst threat to Canadian journalism is, my response is, and I've heard it often, we have to help the media to find a new business model. I was research director for the Presse Française publishing house, and we did the biggest amount of research, and we did this over 20 or over a number of years. There is a thirst for good journalism that needs to be quenched, much more than journalists themselves probably believe. So there is a real market there, but however, it might not be sufficient to sufficiently fund the latter. So given that, we need to help media outlets to find a new business model. It is maybe as absurd and simple as to say we need to get the education sector or hospital sector to develop a new business model. That certainly ain't easy. We can do it, we should do it, but you won't like the solution. So my question for the panelists is the following. If we accept the pretext that a democracy must fund the media as it would any hospital system, then, well, we have to protect freedom of expression, and we have to perhaps hamper free trade and competition. You know, what about killing two birds with one stone, or saving two birds? Should we fund the media by constraining them at the same time, straitjacketing them by striking a press or media council that sets out rules? So I'd like to know what the panelists' ideas are about this. Ms. Saint-Ange. Well, when it comes to that kind of council, that's been one of our criteria for public funding for a long time, but there aren't any such councils in any province, and I believe that we need such oversight councils. But having discussed this issue with a number of publishers, they're not all in favour of mandatory membership, because they believe that that kind of council is, going to be hampering and constraining freedom of expression. So first and foremost, there needs to be a professional code of ethics that is recognised, such as what the Fédération des Professeurs de la Presse has, and other collective agreements that journalists have, a recognised code of ethics, and a level of accountability in terms of what is published, what journalists, publishers, newspapers can publish, and the public should be entitled to criticise them and blame them when media coverage is inadequate. So there has to be some kind of reciprocity when it comes to public funding, and they has to be held to account. Would you like
comments on?
I don't think I have much to add to what was said.
Okay, thank you. Merci beaucoup de votre intervention, professeur.
Thank you, Professor, for your remarks. Senator Sergioel, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Bonjour. I think that the fundamental issue that we're wrestling with is essentially to make sure that the four poles of that structure democracy, which is the media, maintain their vitality and independence in Canada. You know, the vitality of democracy is depending on a large part on the life and dynamism of media and the capacity to perform their duties and role. And there's no doubt that the financial structure of the traditional printed media is a model. I don't like to use that word, but that's the one that is being used, is a model that cannot cope with the new technology. And the fact that the rules or the weight of the new technology, tilt the balance in their favor and at the expense of the traditional media. We all know the financial structure of the Globe, of the Toronto Star, of La Presse, and Le Devoir, and so forth. And when I last night read the budget at page 208, stating that the government will look into a new model that would be opening the opportunity for private foundation to, be the owner of the newspaper and open the contribution in a different kind of fiscal arrangement. I'm still not convinced that this is, the privileged approach that we should be following to really address the fundamental issue of survival. The government has, to me, spread powder on the regional, media by giving them some money for a while, $50 million over 5 years, starting to 18 to 19. I'm reading from the budget, but it won't change the structural problem at all. It will, give them, they will buy time before being faced with the real issue. What is your comments on that approach that the government proposed in the budget in relation of of guaranteeing the survival of the free media, printed media, with their capacity to really play their role in our democratic system?
Ed Greenspon.
Thank you, Senator. First off, I would say that I'm indifferent to whether the media is printed or not. I'm very partial to whether they employ reporters or not. And much of digital media can't afford to, or they're structured not to employ reporters. So it's the matter of having those people who can be vigilant in the way that you described. But whether that moves online, as La Presse has, or is in printed form, is not so important to me. On the measures in the budget, particularly, they seem to me to be the first acknowledgement by the government that there is a problem out there. They're not adequate to the depth of the problem. I don't know if there'll be further manifestations of it. If I sort of think of 2015 when this particular government was elected, this was not an issue that people were really thinking about in a large way. Government had a very busy agenda, occupied agenda, many things in mandate letters. This wasn't there. So now they've begun to think about these issues. I think if you can open up the sector to philanthropic money, that is a positive. It's not a sufficient positive to fix, to address all the problems as you cite, but it's a positive. The $10 million a year will employ 120 to 150 reporters who can be spread out in local places where perhaps we're not having coverage, like courthouses are not covered. We heard about the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court is not covered, trust me, the Court of Appeals and the other superior courts and the provincial courts are not covered either. So I think there'll be an identification of where those gaps. I know we're doing some work on trying to find out where gaps in coverage have opened up. And so again, it's a positive step, but it's not there yet. I don't know what the ultimate answer is. I understand the government's hesitation to put money into enterprises that they think are going to fail shortly after they put money into them. So I think more policy work needs to be done, but I don't think we're at the end of the road. I make one last comment, which is that because you've been in politics a long time. I've watched over the last year since our report came out the political climate, the political equation shifting, and it shifts partly because of the concern about fake news, which has added more concern about the authentic news system. It shifted because communities are being left without papers and journalists who had them before. There's a lot of dynamism in that system too that I think will continue to impel a greater public response.
Pour nous, on est assez.
We have been critical of the announcements in the last budget. They are a step in the right direction. At least there's a building of awareness. However, when it comes to philanthropy in Canada, our culture of philanthropy is not well developed, and there aren't that many benefactors in Canada who invest in this fashion and support media substantively. And they are investing in health, in culture and education to a larger extent. So we are quite sceptical. Another point. There seems to be, and I understand this because I advocate for workers' rights and not necessarily for those of companies themselves, but we have a sense that there is a lack of willingness to support wealthy families, wealthy corporations that are making money in other business lines of business, even though their revenue through newspapers is less and less. But we do need wealthy folks who are prepared to support the media. But maybe that's not the right approach, actually. We would be in favour of a breadth of approaches to support the media. Not all media outlets can be not-for-profits. They can't all be local. They can't all be grassroots. They can't all be national. We need them to be diversified. We can't rely on one single media outlet. Even if it's Radio-Canada CBC, they can't cover all topics of public interest with the plurality of perspectives that are required for real appreciation. So it's a good step. The government is increasingly aware, but we shouldn't be putting all our eggs in one basket.
We've come to the end of the time, and I'm sorry I missed a half hour of it, but the presentations were excellent. The questions and answers, I think, enlightened us all, and you can tell these are media types that speak very clearly, very directly. So thank you very much for all four of you. Now, we hope something more comes of this. That's always the intent behind this, to see what kind of follow-up we can do in the Senate, and so we will contemplate what possibilities lie ahead for us to do that. But I think it's been a very important topic, and a number of senators have been here. They come and go because they've got different meetings, but very, very much a great interest in this subject. So thank you very much.
Simplement ajouter que à l'évidence.
In closing, obviously, whether you're a panelist, a senator, or in the audience, we think that professional journalists are a pillar to democracy as a counterpoint to fake news and as a provider of information to an informed population. It's a heritage, a legacy that we need to protect, and now we need to turn to solutions. And I think the fact that we have three senators, members from the Transport and Communications Committee, attests to the strong interest of this committee in communications issues. So potentially, well, I think that there have been some good ideas fleshed out and food for thought. Thanks to everyone who participated this morning. See you next time.